Good afternoon. My name is Cindy Mazer, and I am the Director for ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution at FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And I represent a subsection of the Interagency ADR Working Group, which is called Workplace Conflict Management. So on behalf of FEMA and the Department of Energy and the Interagency ADR Working Group, I want to welcome you to our session today and tell you a little bit about all the people who helped to make this happen. So this originated as an idea from the Technology Committee, which is also a committee under the Interagency ADR Working Group. And so that group decided that our field is changing, and it's really important that we help each other keep up. And so we have a very distinguished panel today to help us with that. And I'll be introducing the moderator in a second, but Melissa Liebman helped a great deal to make this happen. It was a big undertaking. And I want to thank Elizabeth Bissell for all the help she gives us at FEMA and the people upstairs who are helping to let all the crowds in. So there are a lot of people who help us, including Lee Blackard, who always is here to help us and keep us calm. So thank you. Before we begin today's session, I want to tell you what's going to happen in July. We have a very valuable speaker. Her name is Sarah Reed. She knows a great deal about facilitation. In fact, I would call this shorthand extreme facilitation, and it's going to be an excellent session. She's written quite a bit on this. She calls it facilitation analytics, and the name of her session is going to be Tools to Help You Unpack, Analyze, and Navigate Conflict. And that'll take place on Wednesday, July 26th. That'll be here from noon to 1:30 at the Department of Energy. I think that's really going to be a fabulous session, so mark your calendars. Okay, so about today. Our distinguished panel is actually conducting part 2 of the technology series, and the title, this is our part 2 and final session, is called How to Effectively Use Web-Based Software, Surveys, and Scheduling Tools to Provide ADR Services. So we have 3 panel members, and let me just introduce our moderator. So our moderator is Michael Wolf. You may know him. He certainly was our moderator last time, but let me remind you. And by the way, if you missed the first session, you can go to adr.gov, look under Workplace, and then look under Events, and you can find a recording of what we did in March. So you can catch part 2 if you want to, or if you're missing some part of today, you can wait a few weeks and also catch part 2. So Michael Wolf is the director of the Collaborative and ADR Office in the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And he's also the agency's ULP, Unfair Labor Practice Settlement Official. Before this position, he was Counsel for Dispute Resolution Technology for the National Mediation Board, and he was Director of Mediation Technology for the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Services. So he's adjunct faculty for online dispute resolution at the University of Baltimore, and we're really lucky to have him. He's a great source of knowledge, so I'll turn things over to him. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Everybody here in the room and everybody online. I'd also like to begin by expressing appreciation and thanks. First, thank you to the speakers for their time, their talent, their vision, and their leadership in this field, because these truly are people that you're going to be hearing from that have been exercising leadership on the subject matter that they're going to be talking about. For you, the participants, the attendees, thank you for participating. You definitely make this possible as well. And for the sponsors who were just identified, the Interagency ADR Working Group, the Workplace Conflict Management section of the Working Group, and its Technology Committee. Also for the Department of Energy's Office of Conflict Prevention and Resolution, thank you for all you do to make this possible. Since we're talking about technology, it's good to see that one piece of technology is working right from the beginning, and that's our presentation slides. So today, after these opening remarks, you're going to be hearing from our three speakers. They have some prepared remarks for you, and they're going to leave some time for Q&A and discussion. As you're listening to them, please, whether you're online or whether you're here in the room, jot down the kinds of questions, the kind of things that you're thinking about that you'd like to hear more about or that you haven't heard enough about. And we're going to make sure that we've got some Q&A time and some discussion time for those things that you might jot down. So I'd like to introduce our three speakers all at once, and that way they'll be able to then proceed one after another. First, we're going to be hearing from Daniel Rainey. Daniel is Chief of Staff for the National Mediation Board, and he's also an active member of the ADR community. He's Vice President of the Board for the Northern Virginia Mediation Service and an editorial board member for the Conflict Resolution Quarterly. He's also the Editor-in-Chief of the International Journal of Online Dispute Resolution. He's a Fellow of the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution, and a member of the Self-Represented Litigants Committee of the Virginia Supreme Court's Access to Justice Commission. And that's just touching the surface of the things that Daniel does. He's amazing involvement in workplace matters, in dispute resolution matters, both domestically and globally. Our second speaker is Kevin Buffington. And Kevin Buffington is virtually going to be here. If I ask Kevin if he's here, will I hear Kevin? Or is he...
I'm here.
He's here, and he can hear us. Welcome, Kevin. Kevin has been a commissioner for the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service for 28 years. He's a leader on the and has been a leader on the FMCS team that developed and implemented technology solutions for field mediators starting more than 15 years ago. In addition, he serves FMCS as a contracting officer representative and as an administrator for FMCS's field technologies. He helps support FMCS field agents in the use of their technology in doing dispute resolution. Our third speaker is Margaret Ross. Margaret is a conflict resolution specialist with the EPA Conflict Prevention and Resolution Center, CPRC. Previously, Margaret worked as a strategy consultant for IBM. And at that time, her eyes really got open to what could be accomplished with the effective use of collaborative technology. Since rejoining the EPA in 2009, Margaret's worked on several projects to get collaborative technology tools and training in the hands of EPA employees. She holds an MBA from the University of Virginia and a BA from the Monterey Institute of International Studies. Now, I'd like to, on behalf of the speakers, say that the views that they expressed during this ADR lunchtime series session do not necessarily represent the views of any of our employers or the federal government. So that should make them free to say anything and everything, right? Totally comfortable. Do people who are online know that they can submit questions during the program through Elizabeth Bissell's email address? If not, just jot down Elizabeth with an S, ELISABETH .Bissell, BISSELL, at FEMA.dhs.gov. And that's an additional way that you can submit questions and comments to the speakers. It bears repeating that if you would like to get a recorded copy of both this session and the last session, you can go to adr.gov/events-2017, subject.html, and don't forget the HTML, and you'll be able to pick up a recorded copy of this and the last session. The last session got posted probably several weeks after we did it, so you might want to wait that long to get this session too. Today, our speaker is going to be talking about web-based software, surveys, and scheduling tools that enable us to become better ADR practitioners. There are some important questions in connection with that overall subject matter. Why should we even consider using such tools in our practice? And when might such tools be appropriate? How should we approach the parties? And what specific tools do some leading practitioners use, and why? What should you consider if you want to explore doing the same? And what lessons have been learned along the way? These are some of the questions that our speakers will be addressing today. And in the time available, they'll have a chance to just touch on the most important points. I do want to remember to come back at the end and remind you that if this interests you, if this type of subject matter interests you, please let us know so that we can work to further develop opportunities for you to gain more knowledge and more comfort deciding whether to utilize some of these kinds of tools in your practice in the future. With that, let me invite Daniel Rainey to be our first speaker for today.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to everyone for the invitation to be here, to those who are here in person and those who are online. Good to be with you today. My colleagues gave me two tasks. One is don't go over time, and the other is to talk about some of the things that Michael introduced that are not directly related to applications. There are several applications that we're going to talk about. We all tend to use more or less the same kind of things, so I'm not going to steal their thunder. I'm instead going to talk about why we should be using technology for dispute resolution in the first place, and some of the issues that surround the applicability of technology to the kind of work that we do. I first thought about the idea of applying technology into dispute resolution work quite some time ago, back in the 1980s. I think I've said this before in public places. I helped set up a mediation between Africa, the UK, and the United States using telephones and fax machines. And it occurred to me then and later on that as third parties, as dispute resolvers and people who attempt to resolve disputes, we do three basic things that are fundamental to our practice. We manage communication, and sometimes that means creating channels where they don't exist. Sometimes it means handling communication within channels that exist. We deal with information. We help the parties find information, understand information, and come to some agreement about information. And we deal with group dynamics. Whether it's a dyad in a divorce mediation or whether it's a multi-party dispute, we're dealing with the group dynamics of that. And that example that I gave you from the 1980s sort of drove that home to me very early. There were no communication channels if we couldn't get them together unless we used something like the primitive technologies that we had, telephones and fax machines. But we created communication channels where there were none. And we did it without having to organize meetings and without having to travel to one continent or another. And we did it in a way that worked well for the parties. And by using the fax machines, we were able to exchange information in a way that we could not have done had there not been some way to move words from one place to another that were not spoken words. And in terms of the group dynamics, there were a number of people involved. There were primary negotiators, but there were also interested parties and constituent groups that everybody was dealing with. And one of the things that struck me at the time was that an improvement over doing this face-to-face was that we had the ability for all of those people to actually reach out, touch, and talk to their constituent groups in a way they would not have done if we'd been sitting around a table somewhere. So there were some disadvantages. You always give up some of the nonverbal, and there are some things that you lose. But it occurred to me at that point even that there were some significant advantages that could be accrued by using technology. And so moving forward, and I guess I should, since this is working, I should probably use it, huh? Yeah. So why should we use web-based platforms? The ability to create more communication channels. The National Science Foundation conducted a series of two research projects that I was involved in back in between 2004 and 2010. And the questions we were asking basically were, what difference does it make that you use technology to do the work? And there were several, but the one that we wound up doing a little bit more work on than others was the idea of anonymity. If you have a situation, especially where you have multiple parties or where you have lead negotiators and you're trying to manage the members of each of those parties, the ability to get input anonymously tended to show up in a couple of ways that were really important. One is we tended to get more information because people were willing to say things anonymously that they wouldn't say out loud at the table. And we tended to have a broader range of options to choose from when we were dealing with generating options. I don't know if that means we got more creative solutions, but we at least had more things to choose from in the solutions. And so there was an actual dynamic that was different with the groups that we were working with, and there was an improvement in the sense that by using these tools, we were able to open up channels of communication that we couldn't open up without using them, and that there was a specific advantage that accrued from doing that. Second thing we found was that in a lot of complicated negotiations, the amount of information that's there is really quite overwhelming. In the agency that I work for, we do a lot of long-term contract negotiation, and just as an example, we had one party that came in with 300 open issues. And so 2 years later, we finally got a deal. But over the course of 2 years, the only way that we found that we were able to deal with the complexity of that information was to be able to post it somewhere where people could see it all the time at their leisure. And so we had people we would have a face-to-face meeting, and then 3 weeks later, another face-to-face meeting, and in between, everybody had access to everything and could ask questions online, read everything online. And we found that greatly advanced the process and was a great advantage to the parties. And the group dynamics part of it, again, I think one of the things that we have found in using technology for, especially multi-party, is that if you're at the table, there are certain limitations in the way you deal with the parties in terms of managing the group dynamics. You have small group dynamics, you have interpersonal dynamics, et cetera. You have some options when you're dealing with the online tools that allow you to become a little bit more creative about the way you define what a group is, who belongs to the group, or the group's more fluid, et cetera. And so all of that stuff, if you look at that in toto, for me, it's an indication that using technology has some distinct advantages, but it fits into very nicely the things that we do anyway. So my colleagues today are going to be talking about some technology that I would say goes on the front end of our process. We have to convene, we have to get agreements to mediate, we have to exchange initial information. There are all sorts of things that we do in the run-up to actually addressing the issues. And if we don't do those ahead of time, if we don't do those using technology and allow people to do that asynchronously, then we're taking up time that we're together to do those things. And one of the things that we find in my practice anyway is that things move much quicker and much better and with a lot more agreement actually if we're able to iron all of that stuff out ahead of time at the leisure of the parties. And then when we show up, we're actually ready to go. We've already defined what we're going to do, and everybody's signed off, and we're all ready to go. So that's the kind of technology they're going to be talking about today. So last thing I want to talk about very briefly is, so how do you approach the parties doing this? And one of the things that I would say from my experience is that the pushback in using technology does not come from the parties. It comes from the third parties. It's more difficult to get the mediators, facilitators, arbitrators, et cetera, to agree that it's okay. The parties get it. They will immediately see the value added in the time, the convenience, the money. They immediately see that, and they'll actually push you to use technology where it might not be wise. In terms of what to use, there are literally thousands of applications out there, and you can pick and choose among all of them. But there's a cutting edge question that I would always ask, that I discuss with the parties directly, and that is there a value added by using this technology? And if so, what is the value that we're adding? If I can't answer that question and they don't understand the answer to that question, I won't use the technology. So the question is, am I doing it better? Not am I doing it differently, but am I doing it better using the technology? If the answer is yes, then that's a really great reason to use it. If the answer is no, then you need to question why you're doing it in the first place, because it may be that they're more comfortable face-to-face. Excuse me. And then once you figure out the value added, incorporate that into the approach that you take with the parties. We always do what we call a protocol agreement. It's really an agreement to mediate. And the protocol agreement literally spells out, this is what we're going to do, this is why we're doing it, and this is how we're going to do it. And so all of the parties have a chance on the front end to have input about how we're going to do it, but also to express their affirmation that they're comfortable with the way we're going to handle the situation and the technology that we're going to use and how we're going to handle the technology that we're going to use. Lots of questions embedded in that. We can talk about that at some other time probably, in terms of what's privacy and what's confidential and all of that. We address all of that stuff in our agreement to mediate. I guess the last thing I would say before I turn it over to them to talk about some specific applications is that I think it's almost unnatural not to use technology these days. And the reason I say that is some statistics that I'm sure you all probably already know. I'm working right now with a group from ACR, and we're trying to get ACR, ABA, and AAA together to revise the model standards for mediators that came out back in 2005. In 2005, 5% of the American public used social media. In 2017, it'll hit 70%. 83% of the adults in the United States are on the internet, quote, regularly. 23% of the American adult public says that they're on the internet, quote, almost constantly. So if that is, as a communication channel, if the technology we use becomes the common communication channel that we're used to doing everything in, it sort of begs the question if we don't adapt it to what we do, because it's what everybody's doing with everything else, including finding people to marry. And so the idea that applying technology into dispute resolution is somehow unusual, I think is a concept for the last decade. Right now, it's, if you're not using technology at all, well, why not? And what cave are you living in? Because you probably are, even if you don't admit it. The thing I guess I would stress is the last thing I would say goes back to my find the value added and talk to the parties about it. If you're going to use technology, use it intentionally, use it thoughtfully, and integrate it into your practice in a way that adds value to the piece of your practice that you're integrating it into, rather than simply diving in and using it without thought. So I'll shut up there and turn it over, and we'll talk about some specific applications.
So I think that we're ready to hear from Kevin Buffington right now. And can our technology magicians in the room here give Kevin the screen? He is here.
Okay, yeah, I can see and hear you. I need Lee to make me a presenter so I can share my PowerPoint.
Share your desktop now.
So I'm just waiting on Lee.
You should be all set, Kevin.
Okay.
You should have presenter roles now.
Yeah, I see that. I just don't see a drop down for. Oh, okay. Hang on. Okay, you should be seeing something start to come up here. Okay, it looks like from remotely, it looks like my screen's up, so that's good.
It's up.
All right, well, good morning or afternoon, depending upon where in the country you're located. The Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service uses TAGS, our acronym, to enhance the customer online dispute resolution experience. TAGS is basically our umbrella that houses a number of our software programs. What we find is that conducting some or all dispute resolution and subcommittee meetings, because there is a lot of subcommittees that happen with different main meetings, by using technology, it saves time, money, travel, and stress. There is a lot of stress associated with travel these days. What do we know? We know a number of things. One is, and first and foremost, is confidentiality. It's important to the parties that that they can feel relatively secure in documents that they may place into our hands and put online within our software. And so for that reason, we actually have our own servers in Washington, D.C. We maintain our servers for 2 of our software programs, and that provides a safe and secure data storage. Not about using the cloud where you don't know who's going to have access to that stuff. Even though we're great Microsoft followers in our agency, we still are very restrictive as far as what we put on the cloud. But using our own servers, this allows labor management and other parties to conduct their business like negotiations, surveys, committee work via the internet with relative comfort. We've used this technology, internet-based technology, successfully by our agency in face-to-face meetings, remote meetings, and combination meetings. And that combination meetings are where some people are all in the same room at the same time, and some people are remotely connecting into the room. So we had, for an example, we might have a meeting, we've got an LCD projector up, and we may have one chief negotiator and some participants or an attorney and their clients in one room broadcasting on the internet just through a webcam set up in the room. And we've had the chief negotiator for the union side in New York, an attorney for the company side in California, and one of the vice presidents in the company was on vacation in Florida at the time, just logged in through his cell phone. Another person was in the schoolyard waiting for his daughter to get out of school, and that person was all connected in. So we have a lot of ways to get people to a meeting nowadays. So it's been very successful. Our meetings have ranged from 400 to 400 users in a session. Our online surveys have had thousands of people. Another aspect of our technology is that in most of the software we use, people can access their data 24/7, and it gives examples on the screen, but basically through any internet capable device. Another thing we know is labor and management and other participants have almost in every case saved time and money when they use the technology, and we really know that they like it. Our technology that we use at FMCS for general remote meetings and negotiations, we use Adobe Connect. The biggest benefits of that software is that there's good user controls. You have breakout rooms. You have integrated audio and video, so when we do break people out into a caucus room, their audio and video transfers with them. So they're no longer in the main meeting room. They can still communicate in a sub-room. And then the mediator can move back and forth between the main room or different caucus rooms as they see fit. And with one button you can click and everybody's back in the main room. So very handy to use, very easy. It's been a good product for us. Facilitate Pro, biggest benefits of that software is user anonymity if we want to go that way. That's an option. Its a big thing is electronic flip charting, brainstorming, surveys, reports, and it actually has a scheduling feature too. It's capable of gathering input and evaluating viability of solutions from large groups just as easy with small numbers of people. So it's really a good product for us. We're really happy with it. We've had it for a lot of years, and they keep upgrading it as the years pass. One of the biggest things to using this software is by using the technology, it saves us a massive amount of time that we would spend manually using flip charts. And, I mean, sometimes when you're working on a problem, they wallpaper the place with ideas of things you might be brainstorming. This is all done electronically. It's people putting their ideas up on the flip chart anonymously, whether they're all in the same room, and we have remote people. And once they're up there, you can assess those ideas all anonymously. You don't have to worry about the politics that come with sitting next to somebody and speaking out in front of them. So it's a really good product for us. The last product we use is eRooms. The benefit there is it's primarily for document management, but we'll use it for committee work, and it's available 24/7. When do we have a technology-assisted meeting? Well, when we believe these software tools may benefit an experience. Kind of like Dan was just saying, it's got to be value-added. So usually we can find that it has the ability to save the agency or the party's time, and we're talking about travel time and meeting time. Saves the agency and the party's money. Travel expenses, that cost money. Stress related to travel is sometimes immeasurable. If it can accomplish a better end result by changing the methodology. A lot of times people are less likely to stand up and grandstand using the technology when they would if they were all present in the same room at the same time. You might get somebody who wants to stand up and give a speech for 15 minutes. We find that generally that doesn't happen when you're using the remote technology. And logistics. Logistics need to be in place to accommodate the technology. So as long as those things are there, then we're happy to use it. Organizational involvement, educate our potential users and what we're talking about internally. Like Dan said, sometimes the biggest hurdle is our own people as far as, it's a little extra work and training as far as being able to operate this stuff. But, we give our agents an option that, if they're not comfortable with the technology, we'll have somebody work with them that'll operate that for them. So whether it's myself or someone else, we can satisfy that. But we definitely have ongoing education programs for our field agents, and where they're willing to get that additional training, we're happy to give it to them. If they call us and ask and request basically some technology for their meetings, we give them some standard questions, the 5 W's and how will the technology be used. We ask them these types of things. Can they run a TA meeting on their own, TA, technically assisted? Will they need help in preparing or conducting the meeting? What level of support is needed? In some cases, we may have to go out there and be there physically. Other times, we can support them remotely. It just depends what the situation is. So I'm going to show you some samples of some of the different software products we use. And this is basically, to some degree, a recap of what we did in session 1, but I added some stuff that deals with surveys because we didn't get into that in session 1. But this is a typical Adobe Connect screen. You can have webcams, and you can rearrange the screen however you want. But, we have webcams for the parties up on top. Generally, we don't like to go more than 4 or 5 webcams at a time because the bandwidth, depending upon different people, where they're located and what their speed is, it can have an effect. Ability to share the screen, share documents, and you see on the right side the ability to have caucus rooms and as well as a chat box area. But there's even more functionality to it. But this is I just want to give you a snapshot of that screen. Facilitate Pro. Let me just check one thing here. Okay. Facilitate Pro. This is just an example of our electronic flip charting where they're using this for interest-based problem solving. In this particular flip chart, let me look at the fine print here. They were looking at recruitment interests. They were asking we're trying to ensure vacancies that are filled by qualified candidates. So the why behind the topic, why are we trying to do this? So they're just asking people in general a question. We have it typed on the electronic flip chart, and the different individual people can add ideas anonymously, or they can include their name if they want to with their particular idea. In the first part, we ask them in interest-based. You start with, what are the concerns? Why do you want to approach this particular subject? What are the problems behind it? So we try and flesh that out first. And the second one is where this screen here is about brainstorming, and this is where the people throw their ideas up there. And you see about the fourth item down, it says comments in the middle of that item. If you're using standard flip charts, this would be where somebody has an idea that relates to something that's already up there. So the person that's putting things up on a manual flip chart, this is where they write real small in between two lines and try and fit it in. And then, of course, the people that type it up later trying to figure out, does this belong to the one above or below, if they didn't put a little arrow next to it. Technologically, we just have a button on screen. They click it for the particular item, and they can add their comments directly to something that's already up there. It doesn't even require the any facilitator involvement while the brainstorming is going on, other than being a cheerleader trying to get more items up there. The next stage would be for the people to come up with standards to judge the options by. Once they've created a whole bunch of options, they generally have a discussion over that, and they agree to some criteria. Well, it's got to be affordable, it's got to be beneficial, it's got to be feasible, it's got to be acceptable, whatever they come up with. So in this particular slide, all we do is technically all we do is click a button, and it puts a drop-down next to every item, and they're able to click that drop-down box and evaluate that item. And again, they're doing that evaluation privately on their handheld device or whatever device they're using. Their internet device could be an iPad, could be a laptop, whatever. So they don't have to speak out in front of their political people when they're responding to these items. And then we click another button, and it takes all the input that everybody gave, calculates it as far as the most acceptable, the least acceptable items, reorders the items on a flip chart, and puts them on the flip chart in the order of the most acceptable going down to the least acceptable. And this doesn't have to be a hard-line vote. This doesn't take the discussions out of it. What it does is it makes the discussions more focused. So instead of spending a lot of time with a group talking about somebody's key issue that nobody else cares a thing about, or just having to plow through every item on a flip chart, this focuses a group. Say, you know what, at a glance, the items at the top appeared to be more acceptable. So let's start our discussion at the top and work our way down until we feel we've done enough to resolve the issue. This single fact, this single capability, saves us so much meeting time, it is incredible. These are not the types of things you can do with SurveyMonkey. I've used some of the other survey software, and sometimes people will use that even to try and do brainstorming. They'll run a poll or something like that. This just saves us tons of time. And to the right, next to every item, there's a little graphic box there. And if somebody says, well, I don't know what all these numbers mean, how many people really thought that was a good idea, we can just click that little graph icon to the right, and it will blow that up, and it will show us that in this particular item, this person's idea, and we don't care whose idea it was, because for the first time, we don't know who's putting what ideas up on a flip chart. So all the ideas have the same weight. So for the first time, ideas are being evaluated based upon the idea and not who said it. Because when I work with the military, let me tell you, when the colonel comes out with an idea, it gets a lot of support by his subordinates right out of the gate, whether it was a good idea or not. This is all anonymous. It doesn't matter. the idea a good idea or isn't it? And here it shows next to the items, strongly agree. It says 4 people felt that they strongly agreed with the item. And then as far as agreed, there were 6 people who agreed, 1 person was neutral. And those are the people that responded to that particular item. So very clearly and easily, they can see what the support level was for that. So really good piece of software. We've conducted numerous surveys for customers to identify problem areas, and we've used demographic data to focus problem resolution. Some survey examples that we've conducted for our customers: employee satisfaction surveys, pre-bargaining surveys, strategic planning surveys, labor management effectiveness surveys, committee effectiveness surveys, and we've done surveys even in the schools about bullying. So really interesting, too, because in some of these surveys in the schools, we deal with the elementary school, the mid-level school, and the high school. And we can break down the results based upon the grade. We can break down, in the one particular example, we had the students take the survey, we had parents take the survey, and we had the school staff take the survey. And we could break down all the results based upon these demographic groups and even what grades if we wanted to. And it was very surprising to all involved as far as where this stuff was occurring. Not surprising, it was happening mostly in the play yards, but by whom and who the students went to speak about it, if they felt comfortable enough. And there was just a lot of information everybody got back that they were really surprised about. But we were able to do that in a survey form. This is just an example of one of the surveys, very simple. In fact, it's just a snapshot of a piece of the survey. This isn't the whole survey. But this had to do with this was an employee satisfaction survey. And in this survey, they wanted to know, a couple areas they wanted to know about was supervisory support and communication, diversity, engagement, but there was many sections to the survey. And in this survey, basically it has a statement there. There's a drop-down box next to it where they can select from strongly agree to strongly disagree, and a place for a comment box where they can, add more information if they so desire. But that's just to give you a sample. And generally, when we create surveys for people, we just send them a link, and they distribute that out via email, and they click on the link, and boom, it opens up the survey. We tell them how long the survey is going to run for, and at the end of the survey, we close the survey, and we send out the results to the principals. One of the other things about surveys is that a lot of people don't know how to conduct a survey properly, so sometimes I have to get involved with the field parties to help educate them on that aspect, as well as the fact of you have to remind people when you're doing a survey, it's not about just information you want to gather. It's about what do you plan to do about things once you troubleshoot it, because a survey many times is a troubleshooting device. You're trying to find something out. Okay, well, once you find this out, what are you prepared to do about it? You need to think about that before you even put the survey out. What resources are you going to have available to go fix problems? What level of authority you're going to have to go fix issues? What are your capabilities before you even put the survey out? And then don't word the questions in a way to channel them in a particular direction. So you need to cover all your bases, but you need to put the survey out in a proper manner. This last piece of software is from EMC. It's an eRoom software. This is just an example of a sample labor management committee. And in this, like I say, eRooms is primarily a good document hosting platform. But we do have the capability of using eRoom and as well as our Facilitate Pro with our Adobe. So if we had an active meeting where we want the parties visibly present, we can tie into all this software. So they can bring up their information. Here in this eRoom, they can put their online calendar. They can do planning. They can set milestones. They have their committee information with all the contact lists. They can link to our other software. So That's the eRoom software. One thing I forgot to mention on our Facilitate Pro software, that once they do strategic planning, they also have a function where you can set up a online calendar that connects to the particular items. So you don't have to rely on people emailing other people to say, oh, I'm done with this, working on this particular item or area. They can put that information online, and it's all tracked visibly for everybody. So for our regular scheduling work that we do internally, just for general information purposes, we use Outlook for that. We do all our internal scheduling for meetings that way. And some of our software does tie into Outlook. So if there's any questions, you can always send me an email, contact me later, and we do have a question and answer thing at the end of this session. So I don't want to take up anybody else's time, so I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And now we'll hear from Margaret about their experience with technology and dispute resolution at the EPA.
Hi, everyone. I'll give it a second until we're back up and running. So I am going to be kind of picking up on some of the things that other folks have talked about. Dan talked about how your use of technology in ADR should mimic the face-to-face processes, or should flow from the kinds of things you do in face-to-face processes. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about was how we facilitate processes and how we help to accommodate people in order for them to be able to participate in the processes that we are stewards of. So in a face-to-face meeting, if you have participants who are differently abled, you need to think about and accommodate those participants. So if you have folks who are going to require wheelchair accessibility, you're going to want to make sure that you're in a room that is wheelchair accessible. If you have participants in a process who are visually impaired, you might think about other ways of making materials available, or making sure that they have access to reader or materials in Braille. So this isn't just about having the technologies and using the technologies. It's also thinking about how neutrals are stewards of the processes and the tools that they use in those processes. I'm going to quickly go through these. Excuse me. Adobe Connect, Facilitate Pro, results, eRooms. Okay, here we go. So I have done some work with a company called Kearns and West, and they do dispute resolution and strategic communications. And Jason Gershowitz, their collaborative technology director, said this once, and it's always stuck with me, that when we're using technology in ADR, we are not just working on behalf of the process, we're working on behalf of the people who need to engage in that process. And so we need to be attentive to all of the different things that go along with that, just as we would be in face-to-face meetings with participants in the room. So these are the kinds of things that we use. And internally, like Kevin was saying, we use the tools that we all share to make sure that it's easy for people to engage. We can see people's calendars. We know kind of what people are using to manage their work. So we've got SharePoint, and we've got Adobe Connect and Skype and those things. And people are already engaged in using those tools. There's no additional burden on them to use those tools. So that's what we use. When we're working with folks who are outside of our organization, again, we're trying to think about tools that are easy to use and don't put a high level of burden on those external users. So We use Eventbrite, which is a tool, you don't have to create an account for it. We can set everything up in advance. We can ask people for the information that we need from them in advance of a meeting, including whether they require or would like some kind of accommodation. Document sharing, meetings, these are all web-based tools that we use kind of as a mishmash, right? So we're thinking about which tools we're going to need in a particular process. And then we're thinking about what we have access to, what we have terms of service for, what we're able to access through a firewall, what some of the participants are going to be able to use if they have low bandwidth situations, and what can kind of plug into other tools to make the whole thing work. So those are the things and how we use them. Here's like a list of considerations. Anytime you're thinking about using web-based tools to use in an ADR process, it's like a checklist. You want to be checking browser compatibility. Not everybody uses the same browser. So Adobe Connect, for example, has a plugin problem with Chrome. It's a known issue. It's not been fixed. You got to check it. You got to make sure that folks who might be using Chrome know that that's an issue, so they can either use another browser or they don't have to use the plugin. Terms of service. So there are tons of free web-based things out there. We know about what they are. But as representatives of the government, we have to be careful about what we decide is okay to use. And one of the things you should be thinking about is whether your organization has a terms of service with a software provider. So in addition to using free software as an Anti-Deficiency Act and dealing with all that kind of stuff, what if the terms of service of this free service provider says that they can use the data that you enter or that your participants enter? That's not something that the federal government would say okay to. So in many cases, these software tools need to negotiate with your agency or with GSA in order to make sure that the government terms of service is something that is okay for government users, representatives of the government to use. So making sure that any information that you have folks entering into these kinds of systems is going to be adequately protected and that kind of stuff. The PRA, the Paperwork Reduction Act. I don't know, so how many of you guys in this room have come up against issues with the Paperwork Reduction Act and using technology? There are no hands, which surprises me. So information collection requests. When you ask more than 10 people the same question, you require approval by OMB to do whatever it is. So there are things that you need to be wary of when you're doing surveys online, when you're collecting information from folks. You need to make sure that you know what your agency's rules are and how they govern information collection requests. So when you're collecting things like demographic information or information about people's specific opinions about things, you can ask general, broad questions, but not specific questions. Gathering data can cause problems. So make sure that you're talking with the folks in your agency who deal with information collection requests and the Paperwork Reduction Act. They're there. You can find them in your intranet, I'm sure. Then there's all of the stuff that is the burden on the user. Do you decide to use something that is going to require an end user to create a new account? Do you decide to use something that is going to require them to download something to their computer in order for them to use it? And is that going to work? Creation of accounts, tools, and software where there are special requirements about how you use the software. You can only press on this button to go backwards and forwards. You can't use the normal browsers. Everybody's dealt with this. You're working on a form, you're working on something, and it's all secure, and you've logged in, and everything's ready, and you've spent like 15 minutes on a page, and you're finally done doing the thing that you need to do, and you click submit, and then it kicks you out because you've spent too much time doing all of those things. All of those things present burdens on the user that you're trying to engage and help to participate in this practice or in the process. So do make sure to think about those things and test them out before you use them. Broken SSL certificates and URLs, that has to do with when you're sharing information and you're adding your URLs and you're saying, oh, no problem, let's just send them to this place and they'll get this thing. And a dialog box comes up. Some people are savvy enough to say, oh, this is a broken SSL certificate, so it's asking me whether I can trust this site, or it's saying that the site doesn't match the name of the user who is sitting. Some folks are like, yeah, cool, no problem, I'll trust that site. Some people are not. They don't know what the question is, and they're not sure how to answer it. So think about those things as well. Where does it go? I've lost power. All right. So recently, EPA went through a drill where we had to set up a bunch of public meetings yesterday, ASAP, and make space for folks from the public, from the regulated community, from all over the country to be able to provide input on a set of questions. And because of the timeline, most of the offices involved were not able to put together in-person meetings. It would have limited participation to those folks who live in DC and can participate in a working day and go to the physical meeting location. So folks were thinking about, how do we get this kind of participation, not just from advocates in the regulated community, for example, who might have paid lobbyists who can use their paid time to come and attend this meeting and provide input. How do we get input also from citizens from across the country? And one of the things that we needed to make sure that we did was, when we're asking people to register for this meeting in advance, asking and making sure that we know, and there's a way for them to tell us if they need some kind of accommodation. So do you need closed captioning? Do you need, whatever it might be, do you need any kind of accommodation that we should know about in advance so we can make sure that we have that capability when the meeting time comes? Because that's our responsibility as a part of the federal government, to make sure that anybody in our public can communicate with us. So we tried to make sure that we had multiple modes of communication. So some of the offices just did a telephone call, which works for a lot of people. We tried to create in other offices multiple platforms and multiple channels of communication through which people can communicate. So maybe there's a telephone line, and there's also an online chat room where people can enter comments manually, where people can listen or see visually closed captioning of spoken comments. So again, making sure that there are technologies that are working together to provide adequate communication channels for all of the people who are interested in participating in the process. Providing clear instructions for troubleshooting. This is one of the places where I think we tend to fall down, because I don't know if it's an expectation that either technology will just work and be perfect, or it's a complete failure and we don't want to touch it. There are very few things that kind of land into either of those buckets, right? So most of the things that we do are somewhere in the middle. There are some glitches, there are some problems, but there are usually ways to fix the problems that we encounter. So if there's a door locked, we can find somebody with a key, or if there aren't enough chairs, we get more chairs, right? Technology is no different. We just need to think ahead about what the potential glitches might be, what some common problems are, and how do we educate people in advance so we can avoid glitches. And then when glitches happen, we have troubleshooting tips for not just the most common things, but also for folks who are participating with different abilities and how their tie-ins might work and work differently. None of it's rocket science. It's just kind of testing and thinking through what the problems might be. Yeah, 508 compliance, Paperwork Reduction Act, making sure everything's accessible. Those are just good practices. Make friends with the folks in your agency who deal with 508 compliance and learn all of the different tools that they're going to already have available within the agency that you work for to make sure that these things are available to you in the work that you're doing. And don't ever expect it to be perfect. Give yourself space to learn. Give your participants space to learn. And if you kind of accommodate that desire for growth and that need for learning as we go and kind of adjusting and improving our processes and our uses of technology as we move through them, and just being cognizant of the fact that we are changing things and that requires some time and adjustment, we'll get there. No problem. Super easy. That's all.
So each speaker has been very mindful of their time constraints, and actually each one exceeded their allotted time. So I want to congratulate each one of them for doing that. It also gives you some more time, as well as the people online. And from what I saw earlier, it looks like there's somewhat north of 100 people online who are participating as well. Gives you an opportunity to have some discussion, to ask some questions, to find out some more about the things that intrigue you. So both for people in the room as well as for people online, now is the time, I think, to address your questions to the speakers. And let me ask those of you who are in the room who are managing some of our online process. What's the best way to find out whether we have some questions from people? So it looks like no one online has yet submitted a question, but if you do have some, now might be a good time to do it, as we're looking at questions people might have here in the room. And maybe as you're contemplating what some of those questions might be, some of what I've heard from the speakers, I think are really important points. If you're thinking about utilizing some technology that you haven't yet been exposed to, or maybe are trying for the first time, make sure that you're well trained, and that you pick technologies that require the least amount of training for the parties with whom you work. Make sure you test and troubleshoot in advance. Make sure you're well prepared for both what you expect as well as be prepared for the unexpected, as strange as that may sound. Be thinking about, what's my plan B? What am I going to do if the technology doesn't work as I thought it might? And for any of us who are using technology for anything, we know that it's not going to always work. So what are we going to do when it doesn't work? Just like when the lights don't always work, or when my car doesn't always work. And think about needs for 508 and accommodation, and mind the admonition that you heard from Dan to begin with, that we use technology when it adds value. And if we can't identify a way in which it does, we ought to be asking ourselves, should we be using it? So, and you've heard more too from the speakers. Those are just a few of the things. So what might be some questions that some of you either here or online might have?
We have one substantive question online about whether Facilitate Pro cross-tabulates responses.
So that sounds like maybe a question for Kevin. Kevin, did you hear the question? Can we hear Kevin?
I think Kevin, let's see.
So is this the test or troubleshoot point here?
So speaking of technology, the computer just shut us out of WebEx unexpectedly there when Margaret was going on, and just
So the question was whether Facilitate Pro can cross-tabulate responses. And I
Yes.
believe that if Kevin, when Kevin rejoins us, I think his answer will be yes. It can do that.
right.
So if you have multiple factors against which you're assessing a certain question, and you want to know based upon factors A, B, and C, what might rise to the top that might be the highest tabulated item on all three factors, can Facilitate Pro actually do something like that? And I believe Kevin would tell you, yes, it can.
And Facilitate Pro is not the only tool of its kind. So there are other companies that produce similar products. There's, God, I'm going to blank on them. There's something called Think Tank that I believe is still out there that does very similar kind of process things. And there's another tool called Meeting Sphere that, again, does very similar kinds of things. You know, these are web-based tools where you can add ideas, you can kind of vote on ideas, and for at least Think Tank and Meeting Sphere, and probably, I'm guessing also for Facilitate Pro, those, you can produce exportable files to Excel. So if you wanted to have that data in another format in which you wanted to do deeper data analysis of the information that you received, that's also a possibility.
I would also say that what Kevin presented is a contained package that is sort of cradle to grave for doing cases. We've sort of taken another direction. We basically use sort of ad hoc technology, ad hoc applications to do a specific thing that we need in the work that we do. So instead of trying to create an entire environment in which you go in and you stay for the entire case, more often than not, we're doing face-to-face meetings. We're using some technology to do specific things during that meeting. We're using the technology to connect between meetings. And I'll give you a concrete example. In the old flip chart days, I no longer take notes at all in flip charts anymore, because first of all, I can't write and you can't read it. But I found mind maps are very, very good, and I use FreeMind and I use MindMeister and a couple of others. But one of the things we used to do when we were using flip charts is we would do a very quick and dirty version of what Kevin was talking about when he talked about the surveys in their sessions. And that is, I would do a multi-vote. I would say, we're going to take a break, pick up a marker and go up to the flip charts, and we got 20 items up there. Give me the top 5, your top 5. Just put a mark by your top 5. And then we'd tabulate those marks, and that would help us sort of sort out what to talk about. Well, there's a product that I like to use called Poll Everywhere. It's a freebie. It's on your phone, and you can put up a very quick and dirty poll, and people can use it on their phone anonymously, and literally on the screen it shows you exactly where the items rise in terms of their popularity. It takes no more time than taking a marker and marking, but it's something that can be done very quickly, anonymously on the phone, and it's quite visual. And instead of sort of going through all the shifting of the flip chart pages, it just pops up and it's there. And that for me is an example of where does it add value? Well, it's visual, I can understand it better, it's quicker, it's convenient for the parties. What's not to like? A couple of other quick comments if I can. Oh, sorry. Go
I don't
ahead.
know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah, Michael, you were correct. It does do that cross-functioning tabulations. One of the things on the surveys too, though, and I don't know if the other similar software do this, but when we get our results back, before we even send the survey out, determine what type of demographics we're looking for. So in some cases, for example, we had a survey, we had something like 1,100 people in a conference room. And, they were in a major convention room. And some of the parties that were representing workers in the United States, some were from Canada, and there was a whole bunch of different building trades involved. And we, through the survey process, we very simply were able to click a button and break the results down by whether they were from the United States or Canada, what particular job title that they were representing, and we could see that very quickly. When we did a similar survey with the Teamsters, they had several. It was a statewide California negotiations, and they had 2 companies involved, but 5 different labor unions involved. And we could see the results back in general from everybody, but to be able to troubleshoot it, the big plus was the ability to sort the results by company, by employer, and by union authority area. So having those additional demographic, that functionality at the back end of the survey was a real plus for us, and I haven't really seen that in other surveys that are out there.
Yeah, I'm going to, again, go to the other end of the spectrum. We're talking there with Kevin about very complicated, very professionally done surveys with lots of information to cross-tabulate. And that's an example of the kind of information gathering I was talking about earlier. We're sort of on the other end. Instead of dealing with hundreds of people, we're dealing with parties that we can usually identify a lead negotiator on one side, a lead negotiator on the other side, maybe a couple of attorneys or counsel, and an arbitrator or a mediator. So we're not talking about huge numbers, but as an example of what we do with survey, it's not really a survey, but we use a survey tool. As a concrete example, we will do occasionally a meet-arb process so that we have a mediator working with the parties, and if they don't get a deal done with the grievances, then an arbitrator will come in and will issue bench decisions, or there are various ways that we do it. But we need to have a process agreement in place so that everybody understands what's going on. And in this latest case that we were just dealing with, the mediator, the arbitrator rather, wanted to meet in New Orleans, which was fine with us. So we're going to have the mediator and the arbitrator in New Orleans. We're going to have the parties, one of whom's on the West Coast and one of whom's in Florida, and their attorneys have to agree to the process agreement. So I created a simple survey tool with 2 things. One is a description of where we would meet and when we would meet, and the second thing was the text of the process agreement that we had negotiated embedded in the survey, and the survey question was, do you agree or do you not agree? And if they click yes, we agree, I have a time-stamped signed agreement on the process agreement without us ever having to get together or schedule a meeting. And so now we just book our flights to New Orleans. And so it's a survey, but it's a very narrowly focused 1-question survey, the purpose of which is to timestamp something that I want to have proof of in terms of the process agreement. So you can get a little creative with the way you use some of the survey tools.
So we have a question here, but before we maybe switch gears a little bit, wherever this question might go, I thought it might be useful to just maybe use this discussion to help make the point that there is no one right piece of software out there. The tools, the software, the services, the online options, they're going to keep changing dramatically over time. So what you have seen used in the past is very different than what you're seeing used today, and what you're going to be seeing very soon in the future will probably be dramatically different than what you're seeing today, even if the current tools morph into what the future holds. So one takeaway from this should be that we shouldn't be too focused on what the exact software or service is. It's just what seems to be working for some people today, and what works for you today may be different than them, and what works tomorrow will be different for all of us.
Just one quick add-on for tools like Poll Everywhere. So these are multi-platform surveying tools. So there are software tools out there that folks can use a smartphone or not a smartphone to text a response into a poll, or they can use their computers to respond to the same poll. So the way that you access the information doesn't rely on a particular type of technology. So in terms of if you're thinking about equity issues in the use of technology and gathering input, multi-technology, multi-platform tools like that are one thing to think about.
So good afternoon. I have a general question. Guess you can determine, from the panel. Is there any particular type of mediation model that you see web-based programs best used for? And the second question is, I'm in education system, and we have IEP. We use mediation for IEP facilitation. And I was just wondering whether or not you know of any web-based app that has been used for that, or whether or not it's ADA compliant or, as such.
Does IP mean?
IEP, I'm sorry.
IEP.
Individual educational plans for
Okay.
children with special needs.
Got it.
Well, I can't go there, but I'll go to the first question. I don't think it matters. How to start this? Where we are with software development and dispute resolution is that there are very, very few platforms that were designed specifically to do dispute resolution. There are a couple that are out there, but they're not many. And those that are out there tend to have been developed around the interest-based model that most of us are taught when we first learn mediation. I wrote an article several years ago with a colleague of mine called The Culture and the Code, and what we basically were arguing is that when people develop software for dispute resolution, they are embedding their assumptions about how the process ought to operate in the technology that they create. And so if you look at some of the technology that's out there to do dispute resolution, I think you'll see that that's true. They've sort of tended to be biased toward an interest-based facilitative model. But what I have found in my own practices, I guess, is that I use a variety of different models, a variety of different approaches, and if I'm picking and choosing ad hoc software to do functions that I'm trying to fulfill, it doesn't really matter what model I'm using. It's the function I need to fulfill that's the important thing, not the model that I'm putting it into. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of where I would go with that.
Yeah, it does help. I don't want to monopolize the time, but yeah.
Margaret, do you want to add anything, or?
Since I actually don't know the context of the particular thing that you're talking about with IEPs and what are the nature of the disputes that are arising, but I'm happy to chat afterwards.
Yeah, sure.
But same thing. So we use the hodgepodge method as opposed to Kevin's kind of beautiful all integrated system, though I am very jealous. And so yeah, it's a constant kind of triangulation of what is the thing that we are trying to do at this point in the process with this particular group of people, and what is the best tool that is going to allow us to do that.
It's okay.
Well, even with us, we don't use one tool for everything. We have 4 different pieces of software we use, and it depends on what we're trying to best accommodate.
Do any of you have toolboxes at home, sitting in the garage or something? For those of you who do, you probably find that the best toolboxes are the ones with the most tools in them. Good tools, of course. And the same goes for these technology tools. You're going to find that the best person with the tools is the one who's got the best tools. And so there is no one right tool, and I think that what you're hearing is spot on, that if you look at the function you need to perform rather than the label you apply to it, and then you ask, what tool can help me best perform that function? You may find it's not a tool that's designed for something we call mediation. It may be a tool that was designed for something very different, but which we can either adopt or adapt to what we do as practitioners. So whether it's an IEP facilitation or whether it's a facilitative or some other model, a transformative model, or whatever label you put on it, I would suggest not asking what the label is, but instead what the function is.
As an example, years ago during the Sri Lankan Civil War, a colleague of ours was doing transformative work with the parties in the Sri Lankan Civil War using Google Maps to do mapping conflict areas, and using AM radio, and using online discussion forums, and he was using probably 10 different pieces of software, none of which were designed to do what he was using them for, but he put them into a package to fulfill the functions he needed to try to transform the conflict. So it's almost, the limitations are only your own creativity and what you can find and how you can apply.
And the Paperwork Reduction Act.
More questions? Anybody on the line?
If not, I had a couple of observations I was going to make before we round up. Is there a question?
Are there,
Go ahead, please make some comments.
Now, first of all, a couple of things that I tell the people who work with me about using technology. Use it yourself completely outside the context of the work that you do. I use mind maps a lot. Well, the way I learned to use a mind map is I began using it to keep my to-do list. And so I touched it every day. And so when I'm using it with the parties, I don't have to think about the application at all. It's something I touch all the time. And so familiarize yourself, not so much by training, but just find a way to use it yourself. Find a way to touch it all the time. Never, ever use any technology with the parties that you haven't used with them in a totally non-threatening environment first. I don't call it training, but for example, when we do online arbitration using web-based video, audio, and document sharing, we have about a half an hour's worth of what I would call training, but what the parties look at is sort of game playing, actually. And so I have somebody on staff who gets them together for about a half an hour, and they do something like a brainstorm of the greatest rock and roll songs of all time, or something like that, something that's totally unthreatening, but which makes you touch every piece of the software just to make sure that they understand it in a non-threatening environment. And then when they start to use it for the actual case, they're no longer intimidated by the software, and we do know that it works, and we probably had a chance to troubleshoot some of the things that are going to go wrong in that process as well. And the third point that I would make is that one that you made earlier, and that is that basically every problem that you will run into using technology has an analog and face-to-face. We don't see new problems. We see the same problems in a different venue. And so the same kind of troubleshooting you would do to fix a problem if you were working face-to-face, do the same kind of troubleshooting, and you can usually find a way to make it work with technology.
Kevin, listening to the dialogue here in the room, do you have any other observations you'd like to add before we close?
No, I think everybody pretty well clarified stuff as far as my observation. I don't know what else to say without being repetitive.
So I have one or two, but I'm gonna hold until.
So the one thing that I would say is that at one point, and I don't know if this thing exists or if something else has come up to take its place, but at one point there was an online community of practice that looked at different tools that were available at that time, and this is probably a decade ago, so it would have changed, but it was at the time an incredibly useful thing. It had a list of different functions and then a list of different software tools that performed those functions. And I remember looking at it and thinking, wow, this is incredibly helpful. I wouldn't have thought about some of these things if I hadn't seen this list. I certainly wouldn't have keyed into what the tools are. And I'm wondering whether something like that exists for our field, and if not, whether we should make it.
Michael and I actually put a list like that together several years ago.
The answer is yes, it exists.
But you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's totally antiquated at
Gone.
this point.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Right, so we did that with our long distance engagement guide, but that has a kind of very particular purpose and function. But that is one of the things. If we believe that most people are going to be kind of looking at particular functions within ADR processes, or as we do public engagement processes that use neutral third parties, what are those functions and what are the software tools that are available? Maybe they're available through GSA, maybe there are terms of service already available, maybe somebody's already answered questions about firewalls and security, and we don't have to do that again. That would be really helpful.
I would,
Not to make more work for anybody.
yeah, I think we mentioned before, but I'll mention it again. There's a site, odr.info,
Yeah.
that does have some information
Yeah.
about technology. And actually, I'll suggest that they do exactly what you're talking about. We can try to make a little project about that.
Let's make a little project.
And I think one variation of that is maybe to develop a list of people resources.
Yes.
So that you don't just get directed to some website or some static document, but who are some of the people who are on the leading edge, and some of the people who aren't on the leading edge, but just sort of mainstream practitioners, primarily practitioners, who are utilizing some of these tools, so that maybe you've got someone to reach out to say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you recommend? What have you done? Not only what's worked, but even more important sometimes, what hasn't worked. Because we tend to learn most from our failures, or what may look on the outside like a failure, but hopefully to us is a good learning experience. They're not failures if we learn from them, and if we can do it better the next time. So maybe we can not only develop a list of things, but also a list of people. Or maybe even some people who want to volunteer to be mentors, to be able to sort of partner with you as you develop your abilities.
And for those of you who work in large federal agencies, doing that exercise internally, who are the people? And sometimes it's not the people whose names are listed on the website as being the people, right? So sometimes your best contact for how do I troubleshoot this kind of thing is, you know, a person in another region who happens to be super familiar with it and is willing to share their time to help other people learn how to do that thing. So that kind of internal networking and making sure you know who the Paperwork Reduction Act people are, and making sure you know who the 508 people are, and making sure you know who are the people who sign the terms of service and who are the people who work in the program management IT office. Those are folks that you're going to have to connect with multiple times in order to experiment and try these different things. So make those lists as well, both within the ADR community and within your bureaucratic community, I'll call it.
It's great to follow the KISS principle, to keep it simple, because you try to, conquer the world in one step, and you'll find that you'll trip. So, also having maybe some simple litmus tests. Like a couple weeks ago, I did had to do a video conference involving some people, and I had to think, what will work for someone who is 89 years old, somebody else who's 87, and has never touched this kind of video conferencing technology before, and it's got to work the first time. I mean, that goes back to function. What do you need to do? And it was amazing. This 87-year-old and this 89-year-old, they look like pros doing this because luckily we used the right tool. So hopefully as you move forward, you're going to find the right tools to use in your practice. This is a very important aspect of what we do as practitioners, and I encourage you to embrace it. It will be something that helps make you the most valuable that you can be to the parties with whom you work. As we approach the conclusion here, let me once again thank, first of all, the speakers, second, those of you who have attended both here and online, and for those of you here in the room, we saw that there were more than 100 people online joining us today too. So thank you to everybody. Thank you for the sponsors for doing everything to make this possible. If there's an interest in doing some more of this, or an interest in just you following up with some resource people, please let us know, and we'll try to do what we can to move this forward. Are there any other closing remarks?
Yeah, so we want to add our thanks to the mix as well. And the secret password for people who are getting credit for listening in is Isabella Ferraz, who is our fabulous partner here at Department of Energy. Isabella is our secret password. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.